A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Sometimes we think of disciple making as meeting together in a small group with a leader or some sort of a mentor who helps us think and act as we ought to be aligned with Christ. Now, that may be partly true, but our special guest through these coming minutes says disciple making happens outside the walls of your church every day. Paul Bartlett is back with us. He's the founder of Mobilise Australia, a unique and proven model that he works with that helps rethink the way you transform your community. He hails from the Illawarra and joining us now. Hey, Paul, welcome back to 2020.
Hey, Neil, great to be with you again.
Paul, you work with church leaders often, and you help church leaders think differently about being a disciple maker. Is there some sort of a caricature because, the way that church leaders often don't have the high priority of disciple making, and you're bringing a different dimension? How do you see church leaders typically?
Yeah, well, look, I've been in a really privileged position over the years, one, being a senior pastor myself for 22 years. I got to see that. I served under a senior pastor myself for 20 years before that. And, of course, with my role with Australian Christian churches as well, so I've actually worked with hundreds of churches, so I have a unique perspective. And the one thing I've seen all the way along is typically we're very church-centric. And so I often remind churches this because I think it needs a rethink. I think most churches have kingdom-centric values, but what they don't know is they have church-centric strategy. And what it means is, for example, Neil, one of the things I do when I'm teaching Mobilise is I get people, to leaders and pastors, to draw a picture of what they think their church is or why it exists. Most of those pictures are pictures of people walking into a building. And that's church-centric, right? Because a kingdom-centric picture would be people walking from the building called church and going into their communities, which is what the Bible says, Great Commission, going into their communities and discipling people to Christ. So I think there's a big rethink needed across the whole church in Australia.
And interestingly, that doesn't have any denominational barriers with it either, because someone might have an upbringing in one other denomination that might be perfectly fine, but you're not trying to necessarily win them into your church strategy, but to align them with the kingdom. And if your church grows, well and good. But there's different ways of thinking about it. And, this idea of church versus kingdom, sometimes it's confusing.
Yeah, it's confusing. In fact, another great example of a kingdom value, in fact, we did this in our local church, is we constantly taught our people that we are going to love our community even if they never come to our church. And so the love of our people outside of our church was not conditional on whether they showed up to a service or not. And actually, when we developed that culture for over 20 years, I led a church here in the city of Wollongong. One of the reasons why we became the church that our city couldn't live without was because we became known as a church that seemingly, unconditionally loves, serves and does acts of kindness in the community without the tension that you need to come to church to experience what we're doing. Now, of course, the result of that was the community loved the fact that we didn't have an agenda or we weren't pushing to get you to something. Because of that, when people were ready to decide to come to a church, they came to our church.
I remember an earlier conversation that seems to fit in very nicely with this one, because while you're busy doing those things that might serve your community unconditionally, you add coffee into the mix and you create an opportunity to be able to share something personal from your heart.
Yeah, well, as you know, Neil, I wrote the book, Thank God It's Monday. And I wrote Thank God It's Monday because I was sick of seeing Christians hashtag TGIF, Thank God It's Friday. I couldn't work out why on earth Christians would work all week in a job that seemed purposeless, or they had to do it because they needed money for the mortgage and the kids and I get that, all to arrive on Saturday, their day, and go to church, which apparently was God's day, My message to people is, why don't you teach people that God doesn't have a favourite day, that every day is purposeful, and that the only way truly we're going to reach the numbers of people in Australia that need to be reached is not by trying to tell your people to invite people to church, but to mobilise and equip your church people to reach their friends, family and colleagues to Christ every day of the week. I mean, it's a simple thought to me. I did Thank God It's Monday. I taught my church. I just thought that's what everybody thought like. I thought the kingdom idea of loving people whether they come or not was normal. Well, as I began to do this more and more, people began to invite me to speak. And I began to find out, hang on a second, this kingdom culture of not making it just about Sundays was not as normal as I thought it was. And so we've been able to help and continue to help, hundreds of churches now mobilise their people.
The usual thing in church life is to help people think more about church. And you mentioned, Thank God It's Monday, but your latest book is called Rethink It, Unlearning How We Think to Reach a Changing World That's Thinking Less About Church. So in some sense here, you're saying think kingdom, but even though church is the place where you're being nurtured yourself, you need to think kingdom, and the church will grow because you're thinking kingdom.
Exactly. In fact, I can tell you, just as recent as last week, many leaders would know Kerry Newhoff from Canada. He's a great leader at the moment, speaking globally into many topics and thinking around leadership. He just grabbed a Barna report, not just on America, but across the world, interviewing pastors on how effective they thought outreach and evangelism was in their church. Did you know that 99% of churches around the globe in this survey said that they are ineffective in outreach and reaching people in the community? And I would say the number one reason for that is because we constantly are trying to get people to come to us instead of training and equipping people to go to them. And the simple thing we are training people to do is moving from a church-centric strategy to a kingdom-centric strategy, which I can tell you doesn't stop people coming from church. In fact, long-term, more people will come to know Christ and more people will turn up at your church eventually. But we've got to change our model.
And you're not saying don't go to church. I think you're saying church is really incredibly important, but it's getting involved with people outside of your church in the everyday stuff of their life, which might be, disciplining children or just looking after the usual things that people are challenged with.
Well, imagine this, Neil. Imagine if we went back a couple of thousand years and you walked up to the Apostle Paul and you said, "Oh, Apostle Paul, just want to say the worship was great today." He'd be looking at you like, what do you mean? Your life as a living sacrifice was great today? Because that's a biblical version of worship, right? So the theological version of worship is that you lay your life down for Christ, right? That's really the biblical version. But worship in the modern church is become a song or something you attend or turn up to. And I'm not in any way saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying, how far has the church got away from the original model, which is church is absolutely needed. And one of the things I've had to defend a little bit, over the years since I wrote Thank God It's Monday, I'm not pitching Monday against Sunday. I'm just simply saying, guys, you know how you can tell, Neil, I do a session I do two sessions in Mobilise. One, the 7 sins of jargon. Why jargon is killing the church, because we've got our own foreign language that nobody outside the church can understand. So I teach people how to speak on Sunday just like you would speak to anybody on Monday. But really the second thing is take your social media. Social media looks like this in most churches. On Monday, we're saying, how great was yesterday? And a picture of hands raised or a picture of a Bible or pulpit. Tuesday's the same thing, just reflecting on how good the sermon was on Sunday. Wednesday, I joke around, Wednesday's completely blank because we're too far from last Sunday and we're too far from the next. But thank God for Thursday. We start the countdown, only 3 days to go. Friday, 2 days to go. Saturday, we can't wait for tomorrow. And our social media in our local churches reflects the fact that we are actually church-centric, not kingdom-centric. What we should be doing, this is what I teach people in Mobilise, is what about Monday? You go and photograph a local hero who is doing something great in the community and tell their story. What about you just walk down to the local park and on Tuesday and post, I love my city or I love my town, and and just make your social media reflect the 7-day church, not just the 1-day-a-week church.
And the thought of the contagiousness of faith, it doesn't come just through using biblical terminology, as you say.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dimensions to an individual, but that sort of stuff is about values being caught rather than, in that sense, being taught. The contagious Christian idea is what happens when you are matured in your church life and then living those things out.
Exactly. And Alpha released a statistic not so long ago saying it used to take 8 or so interactions with a non-Christian from a Christian to bring them to Christ. Did you know that's doubled? It takes 16 interactions before somebody is willing to receive Christ. So that means there's a lot more pre-church steps that are involved in, and I can tell you, Neil, my experience, because I have non-Christian friends, I've been leading non-Christians outside the church to Christ for the last 25 years, I actually believe people are interested in faith. They are interested in God, but they want to hear it in normal language from somebody they trust every day of the week. They'll eventually be ready for the church, but most people are not ready for the church experience yet. Again, yes, the goal is to bring them home, and the goal is to have them sitting in church. But I tell you, to take somebody from the first conversation you have to inviting the church, it's too much of a leap in Australia today, and we've got to work out the steps, and that's what Mobilise does. We coach and train Christians in the process of engaging with their own local community in a way that gradually leads them towards Christ.
Well, Paul, there'll be listeners who will be thinking this is a very refreshing conversation to have. And yes, of course, things need to be thought through, and the way we relate with our local church and the commitment we have for our local church and the activities there. But what happens in the interactions with those people in our workplace, in the broader marketplace, with our community and our neighbours, those sorts of things are so important. Hey, for listeners to visit your website, mobilise.au, what will they see there? Is there something to interact with? Is there some courses that you've got for people to do?
Absolutely.
What's on your website?
So, firstly, straight away, if you haven't read Thank God It's Monday or Rethink It, they're 2 great tools that will help you. But if you go over to the training, there's a little click on for the training. I can do anything from a 20-minute staff and team meeting online. I recommend the full course, which is I or my team, we come in and we do it over a 4-month period, because I believe changing your culture, you have to slow it down. And I've created a training/coaching. So I will come in, doesn't matter what denomination you're from, do 3 one-day training in person over that 4 months. And in between, I'll do a coaching session that will coach your team to change your culture towards community. But the great news is I've created a playbook, and every participant gets a playbook that has coaching questions that basically you can run the leader of your church. You can do that every week with your team, over a coffee. There's coaching questions where you lead your own church towards engaging with your community. So there's that big picture. Or I can just come and do a full 1-day session on, basically it's divided into these 3 things. I call it the mirror, which is the rethink it phase, looking at why you do what you do, your current thinking and your current methods. The second one is the skylight. Well, what does the Bible say about church and community? Let's look at your theology and what's tripping you up. And then lastly, the window, so it's looking in, it's looking up, and it's looking out. And the window is, I will teach you practically how to turn your church from a church-centric to a kingdom-centric, and how you can mobilise your people practically every day of the week so you become the kind of church or city or town can't live without. So all of that information there. There's an email, paul@paulbartlett.com. you can email me on that. I'd love to have a chat or a virtual coffee online if you're interested to talk about how I can serve you in that way.
So that website is mobilise.au, and you can hear just what a great communicator Paul Bartlett is, and making himself available for your church, and that means wherever you might be in Australia, if you can do those online activities. Paul Bartlett is the founder of Mobilise Australia. He's also National Leader for Community Engagement for the Australian Christian Churches. He's based in Wollongong, and those two books we mentioned, Rethink It, that's the latest one, and Thank God It's Monday. Mobilise.au. Paul, thanks so much once again for sharing your insights with us today on 2020.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.